Welcome to everyone in the second of this term's Centre for International Education seminar series entitled Knowledge, Society and Difference. And we're delighted to welcome tonight's speaker, Professor Vanessa Andreotti, who holds the Canada Research Chair in Race, Inequalities and Global Change at the University of British Columbia in Canada. So Vanessa is a highly active scholar and social activist. And indeed, she brings these two things together in highly creative and energizing ways, as I'm sure you will see. So in addition to her contributions to debates about global citizenship and decolonization, she's been extensively involved in the fight to defend the rights of Indigenous peoples, both in North America itself, in Alberta, as well as in the Amazon in Brazil. Tonight with us, she's going to discuss the complexities and difficulties of working towards decolonization, a topic that's become something of a buzzword, can be invoked in quite a tokenistic way, but that is not at all the case for Vanessa's work, as you will see from her discussion tonight, which draws on her ongoing project, gesturing towards decolonial futures. So please join me online and in the room in welcoming Professor Vanessa Andreotti. Thank you. Over to you, Vanessa.
So thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you, Barbara, for the introduction too. I feel very honored to be here. So in Canada, what we're asked to do by the Indigenous people of the place is that we acknowledge the territories we're in. So I'm speaking to you from the Kwantlen, Katsi, and Stolo territory. These are unceded territories, which means that they have not been given to the state. But I also come from a mixed heritage family of Indigenous and German ancestry in Brazil. I was actually born out of attempts to stop colonial violence by my father. My father was, in his family, his brothers were involved in the colonial expansion in Brazil, in agrarian expansion in the 60s. And he was very much against it, wanted to make a stand about it. Coming from a German family, also influenced by Western cowboy movies. And he decided to marry an Indigenous person, my mom, but he also believed in the supremacy of the German culture. So that was the paradox where I come from, where you are trying to do something progressive, but also at the same time very problematic. And I think my educational life, my upbringing, and now my professional life have been focusing on these kinds of paradoxes of working towards changing the world, but still carrying the old world with us. And because of this background, then I sought advice from Indigenous communities in Brazil about how to do a land acknowledgement, and they do it differently in Brazil. So from a Guarani elder, I was asked to do a different kind of acknowledgement. So it's 4 acknowledgements. Please bear with me. It's a little bit long for an acknowledgement. So the first acknowledgement is the acknowledgement of the land as a living entity, not resource or property. So acknowledging that the planet that we live in, that we're part of, is a living metabolism that is currently under strain. The second acknowledgement is the acknowledgement of our ancestors and the responsibilities we have towards them. But the ancestors are not just those who have come before us, they are also those who are coming after us. So bringing the future generations into this conversation is very important, and our responsibility towards that. The third acknowledgement is acknowledgement of those who have made this meeting possible. So generally in a face-to-face meeting, it would be the acknowledgement of the people who have, the people who are responsible for transport, our families that are supporting us to be here, those who have planted and made the food that we were going to share. But in an online environment, I think we need to acknowledge that the screens and the minerals that go into the screens are coming from communities in the global south and not as well, that are being exploited, and there's expropriation and a lot of violence that goes into the making of these computers. And the operation of the internet that we also benefit from, and we are implicated in, and we're implicated in systemic harm. So it's important to acknowledge that too. And the last acknowledgement is the acknowledgement that we're all relations, that we're all kin, or family of both human and non-human. It's a complicated family that is in a, I would say, an unhealthy environment right now, right? So there is a call for us to move towards more sobriety, maturity, discernment, and accountability in search for what they would call healing, basically healing of relations, healing of our thinking, healing of our the way we process emotions, healing of the way we exchange things, and the healing of our relationship with the wider metabolism that is the planet. So with this acknowledgement, I would like to start the presentation, which is going to be about the work of the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective. So it's important to say that I don't work on my own. I do have a team behind me, which was a lifesaver. I think it was 2015, I was thinking about quitting academia and really walking out, because I just, yeah, I couldn't, I found resonance in relation to my work, but I couldn't find anything that would sustain healthy relationships within the institution. And from 2016, I got a grant to work on decolonial futures related initiatives. And since then, a group of people who are curious about the same things have got together. We do not, we are trying to create a similar vocabulary, but we do not agree actually on everything. But we do, we say we don't back each other up, but we have each other's backs. So that was an amazing discovery of how to work within academia, within a crack in academia, with people who are not competing with you, who are supporting a certain form of inquiry, and who are seeking depth in that inquiry. So I would like to honor them today, but I think what I'm gonna start with is just by saying where I'm coming from in terms of my previous scholarship. I have been for 20 years in the field of global citizenship education, trying to map global North-South relations in terms of problematic patterns of representation, engagement, and translation. So these maps became maps of intellectual, affective, and relational economies that are part of what I refer to as modernity/coloniality, with reference to the Latin American modernity coloniality group. But the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective is an arts/research collective that is transdisciplinary, and it is a group of researchers, artists, educators, students, and indigenous knowledge keepers that work at the interface of questions related to historical, systemic, and ongoing violence, and questions related to the unsustainability of our current habits of being. It brings together concerns related to racism, colonialism, unsustainability, climate change, biodiversity loss, economic instability, mental health crisis, and the intensification of social and ecological violence. It's grounded in what we're calling a non-Western psychoanalytic approach, informed by work with Indigenous people in Latin America and in Canada. But we're not it's not an extractive approach. It is an approach where we go through some learning and we translate what we're learning for ourselves into pedagogical activities and exercises. And the collective tries to create pedagogical containers for difficult conversations to happen without relationships falling apart. So it's like bringing people together to hold space for difficult and painful things without them, with the preparation so that they are not immobilized or overwhelmed with the discomfort, and they are not trying to be rescued from it. And I think it's important to say at this point that over the whole summer, we have been heavily involved by with the emergency in Brazil. There is an indigenous emergency in Brazil where the government has mounted a coordinated legal and judicial attack against indigenous rights and lives, and in order to be able to open up the Amazon forest for predatory industries, or to predatory industries. So we're coming out of this very intense period of activism and support for our collaborators there. And we're trying to digest all the learning at this point. So what I'm going to show you today is not necessarily related to that, to the new learning, because this is still being brewed, but to what we have been doing before that. And I think things are going to change once we can digest what we've learned in the last summer and continue to be learning as we continue to support the communities in Brazil. So I mentioned the non-Western psychoanalysis. I just want to go back there for a minute to talk about what we mean by non-Western. It's this idea of not being logocentric or anthropocentric. And this, as I said before, is coming from practices of health and well-being that we see both in Canada and in Brazil amongst the indigenous communities. So it's a practice not grounded in meaning, the search for meaning, or on human bodies or human exceptionalism. So it sees the earth as a conscious entity, and it has practices that allow you to experience it very differently. Psychoanalysis here, the word psychoanalysis is a very tricky thing to use, because psychoanalysis is by definition based on anthropocentrism and logocentrisms, but it's the closest term that we have to describe a practice that is Western, that has resonance with what we're doing. So we're talking about, in this case, the conditioning, in our case, the colonization of the unconscious, the fact that we're libidinally attached and socially rewarded for reproducing modern colonial desires and entitlements. And this is extremely difficult to interrupt. So in our project, because of the composition of the project, we have people coming from backgrounds of addiction. And these people say that it's similar to an addiction and akin to addiction, in the sense that it's similarly difficult to interrupt. We also talk about the rearrangement of desires that Gayatri Spivak talks about, education as an uncoercive rearrangement of desires. But this rearrangement of desires is largely unintelligible within the mainstream culture. It's pedagogically counterintuitive. It's emotionally unpleasant and physically uncomfortable at first. And it initially is felt like a loss or disillusionment or disenchantment, because we're interrupting satisfactions that are socially rewarded. And four, it starts with the interruption of univocality, self-transparency, and imposed coherence, which involves losing satisfaction with objectivity, rationality, universality, logocentricity, and one's crafted self-image. And that's also a difficult thing to do. So our analyses are anchored. Oh, sorry, I forgot, I skipped. In terms of the psychoanalytic approach, the non-Western psychoanalytic approach, what we try to do is map relational patterns. And this is just an example of one of the maps that we have done before. And we mapped this modern colonial unconscious imprints in terms of 6 C's of consumption, which is a mode of relationality marked by choice, comfort, convenience, certainty, calculus, and control. And by this, we mean that we are rewarded when we manifest these imprints. 4 A's of arrogance, which are characterized by demands for autonomy, like unrestricted autonomy, epistemic authority, justice arbitration, and egological affirmation. There are also four P's of purpose, which are desires for protagonism, purity, progress, and privilege. 3 R's of redress that are limited to representation, recognition, and redistribution. And the 3 I's of innocence, which is assumed indemnity, immunity, and impunity within modernity coloniality. Now, the point of the collective is to figure out experiments that could interrupt these patterns, and we mostly fail, of course. So what we have had to develop is a practice where the failure is also important. We call it good data. So our analysis are anchored on 4 denials, or 4 constitutive disavowals, as the term is in psychoanalysis. So these 4 denials are the denial of systemic violence and complicity in harm, the fact that our comfort, securities, and enjoyments are subsidized by expropriation and exploitation somewhere else, the denial of the limits of the planet, the fact that the planet cannot sustain exponential growth and consumption, the denial of entanglement, our insistence in seeing ourselves as separate from each other and the land, rather than entangled within a wider living metabolism that is biointelligent, in the denial of the magnitude and complexity of our collective predicament, the tendency to look for simplistic solutions that make us feel and look good, and that may address symptoms, but not the root causes of wicked systemic challenges. And in this case, it's important to say that when we see complex, wicked challenges as just simple problems, we will come up with approaches that will reproduce 3 things. The first one is, of course, simplistic solutions. The second one is paternalistic forms of engagement, particularly with historically marginalized populations. And the third one is ethnocentric ideals of justice, sustainability, and change. And these 4 denials that are the anchor of our analysis are systemic issues. So they are not individual denials. They are denials that are rewarded in social systems. So that's why they are also very difficult to interrupt. We talk a lot about also the difference between seeing education as a problem of information, where you just present the information and people then have an enlightenment moment and they change their behavior, which is the theory of change of that kind of education, and education based on socially sanctioned constitutive disavowals or denials. Because when you're dealing with education as a problem of denial, the moment you present the information, you get the pattern of shooting the messenger, right? So in education that addresses denials, you do need to find a way to disarm the defenses of the ego before you even get anything to land. So that's why we use a lot of metaphor and social cartographies and images and artistic experiments, embodied experiments, land experiments, because cognitive descriptions do not work. Like, it's not that they do not work, that they're very limited in what they can do in this type of education. And we're going to be talking a little bit about that in a minute. So as an example of one of the social cartographies that we use, this is a very popular one. This is one called The House Modernity Built. So this was the way that it came about was that we had the first frame that was created from theory from indigenous, abolitionist, critical race theory. We try to put it all together in one image, where that is here represented in a house of modernity that is sitting on a planet, and the house is exceeding the limits of the planet. And this house has a foundation of separability, which means the separation between humans and the rest of the planet, which then we tend to call nature, as if we're not part of nature. Then there are two carrying walls, one of universal reason, the other one the nation state, that represent the universal reason wall represents the single story of progress, development, human evolution and civilization. The nation states represent the forms of organization that will protect property and concede rights as long as there's interest convergence between the rights of property and the rights of human beings. And then there's global capital as the current roof, which is shareholder speculative, a shareholder speculative form of capitalism, which we call there is a structurally damaged roof. So what happened was that we started with that frame, and we workshopped it with different communities to see what other frames could come out of it, both indigenous communities and non-indigenous communities. And we started to have several versions of a series of images for this cartography that became very useful to start conversations. So the cartographies are not meant to represent things objectively. They are not ontic cartographies, they are post-representational cartographies. So the cartographies we use are meant to visibilize things that our unconscious will tend to avoid and to start conversations, but also to multiply the interpretations that we have of things. So in the second frame, we have the hidden cost of the house. I'm not going to go into the cartography in detail, but it represents how the house is subsidized and maintained by violence. Then there are the different floors of the house, how people relate to the promise of universal middle class for all, which we believe is a false promise. And then there is the thing about facing the crisis of the house, the socioeconomic, political, ecological, and mental health crises that are coming with the weight of climate change, economic instability, the cancellation of rights, precarity, populism, and pandemic. And the questions about whether we fix the house, we expand the house, we build another house, we live without a house, we learn to find another shelter, or we find another planet. We also try to map how the house has limited the ways we can even address or encounter these questions. And this is one of the cartographies we use for that, which is called Boxhead. And in the frame of Boxhead, you will have several of the intellectual imprints of modernity coloniality that make things intelligible in the mainstream within the house, right? So there's dialectical utility maximizing thinking, there's allochronic and anthropocentric modes of reasoning, logocentric, evolutionary, Cartesian, and teleological ways of relating to knowledge. So this all translates into a frame where for us to be intelligible, even if we're criticizing some of these imprints or these patterns, we need to reproduce others. So if we decide not to reproduce any of these patterns, we become unintelligible within the house of modernity. And this is a characteristic of a mode of being, of a non-metaphysics, where the security of the certainty of knowing grounds the security of being. So where being is grounded in knowing. And this is also a difficult thing when we're thinking about translating different onto metaphysics into the house or into modernity coloniality, because we tend to translate these knowledges as if they are based on the same ontology, that knowing is what grounds things. And we're working with communities where it's not knowing, it's vision that grounds being. So it's very interesting to see the differences in what is made possible when articulated knowledge is not the ground for being. Another thing that we do is we try to, like, based on Jung a little bit, we try to map archetypes from a decolonial perspective based on the desires, entitlements, and archetypes of the modern colonial subject. So this idea of the archetype of justice arbitration, which is the judge, the righteous, the expert, the archetype of moral authority, the leader, the problem solver, the change maker, the archetype of the person seeking unreserved admiration, the savior, the hero, the martyr, or the duty affirmation, the guru, the chosen, the carer, or unrestricted autonomy, the innocent, the virtuous, and the deserving. So we're trying to problematize both agency, benevolence, and exceptionalism, and especially this thing that we find in education. I find it a lot of people wanting, like in post-humanism, or people talking about the Anthropocene. In this idea, this search for connection with the wider metabolism with the planet, but there is a tendency in that to want to connect with the flowers, the moon, the sun, and the whales, but not the shit, like the pollution, the guns, the murders, the exploitation. So there is usually a sanitization of the parts of humanity that are not beautiful, that are broken, that are really messed up. And the decolonial approach really tries to foreground that, and saying that if we can't deal with, when we do use the metaphor or the image or analogy of shit to talk about that, because if we can't compost shit together, both individual shit and collective shit, there's no starter. We can't skip that process and go towards a more beautiful future if we don't go through the painful and the difficult things. So this is one of the things that I think is very particular to the work that we do, that in the creation of these containers. One of the things also that we've learned with this from the communities is that humor is very important, because the content is really heavy and we need a light container to hold it. So having these conversations both with a specific kind of humor and with a lot of compassion is extremely important. So another thing that we've been talking a lot about is a relational imprint of the seesaw. So this relational imprint actually comes from Pajé Barbosa, one of the elders in Brazil. And his teaching was that our society is based on a +1 -1 dynamic, and that the point that we needed to get to was 0. So the +1 means that we idealize and romanticize both ourselves and others and everything. And we're either at the top or we're at the very bottom. So the +1 means idealization, romanticization of something. -1 means vilification and pathologization. And we are afraid of vilification and pathologization, therefore we seek idealization and romanticization. And the 0 then would mean being able to sit with the good, the bad, the broken, and the messed up of humanity within and around us. But most importantly, this seesaw relational imprint creates a form of politics that is intelligible within the house of modernity, that is based on what we're framing as the 5 E's. It's based on exceptionalisms, so generally human exceptionalism in general, but also the exceptionalism of one group or another. It's always a competition of exceptionalism. It's also based on exaltation, the need to keep affirming the +1 status of whatever group or yourself in order to argue for the expansion of entitlements, generally colonial entitlements. There's also the externalization of culpability and ego empowerment. So a politics that is not based on the 5 E's is largely unintelligible within the house that modernity built. So with that, what we're trying to do is create a form of depth education. And what we mean by depth education is an education that can surface the problematic aspects of our individual and collective unconscious, that can work from unknowability, that can disarm effective landmines and ideological defenses. And we do that, we try to do that in order to activate capacities that have been exiled by modernity coloniality. And two of them I describe here. The first one is negative capability, which is the capacity or disposition to engage with difficult issues and be present for uncomfortable conversations without feeling overwhelmed, immobilized, or demanding to be rescued from discomfort. And generative capability, the capacity or disposition to navigate volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, which is the acronym VUCA, and to recognize different sensibilities in context of historical and systemic dissonance with integrity in generative ways. So again, back to images and metaphors, one of the things that we use to describe the work is the SMDA complex. SMDA stands for sobriety, maturity, discernment, and accountability. And we use the image of learning to walk a tightrope with rational rigor and relational rigor. And learning to walk this tightrope means recognizing two pitfalls or traps. One is the trap of desperate hope, which is the search for either the right ideology or a heroic authority or the chosen people or a special practice or a return to a place or time that is characterized by nostalgia, and on the one hand, and then reckless hopelessness or desolate hopelessness on the other hand, which is characterized by absolute relativism, which in the collective we call whateverism, hedonism, misanthropy, nihilism, and the banalization of cruelty and brutality. So this tightrope, what we try to do is to walk with humility, humor, hyper self-reflexivity, and honesty being, honesty is not there, it disappeared. So honesty is about being able to sit with the shit and everything else that is around us, not trying to idealize or romanticize ourselves or reality or others in order to find escape from the difficulties that we have to face together. So partly the educational project is kind of recognizing that where we're at, it's very difficult to sit with everything. And therefore, instead of giving people an easy answer, is what we need to do is build the capacity so that we can sit with the good, the bad, the ugly, the broken, and the messed up, and the humanity within and around us all. So most of these ideas are described in the book Hospicing Modernity. This is not strictly an academic book. It's an educational book. So it's full of exercises and stories. I did not think I would use personal stories there when I started writing the book, but the book treats the stories as entities and modernity as well as a who rather than a what, as a who as in a living system that lives within and around us and that does things to us. But it does start from the premise that modernity is dying and we need to hospice it. And it offers this as a thought experiment. You don't have to agree with it to be able to engage in the exercises, but you need to be open to contemplating the possibility that we are on the path to extinction. And in a way, we are always on the path to extinction. At some point we're going to, but this extinction has been accelerated by human wrongs that we have difficulty sitting with. So the book invites you to engage with that, and there are lots of caveats. So there's a whole, I think it's a third of the book is trying to convince you not to read the book because in many ways, this kind of education is not for everybody. It requires people to be at a specific moment in time to be able to engage with that. And it can be harmful if you're kind of pushed to the deep end, you can drown, basically, right? So we have to, there's an ethical responsibility to be very careful with the invitation. But the book tries to do that with a third of its content, and it just invites people to see hospicing modernity as walking that tightrope between naive hope and reckless hopelessness, and exploring possibilities that disinvest as opposed to divest, which is different actually. It's not about walking away. It's about learning to disinvest from modern colonial forms of social economy, nation states and borders and as mediators of relations, separability, superiority and status, a single story or a single rationality and story of progress, development, and evolution, and social mobility as the purpose of life. It also invites us to disinvest from consumption of goods, knowledge, relationships, experiences, and critique as a mode of relating to the work. So I think that's what I had to say today. And I am really looking forward to the conversations that are happening after the 15 minutes of the buzz that was structured in the talk. So thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Vanessa. I knew it was going to be rich. That was stunning, full of lovely metaphors and really provocative. Thank you so much. We will now break into breakout rooms online for 15 minutes and in our room on our tables to discuss Vanessa's very provocative and illuminative talk with the aim of generating questions when we come back in 15 minutes time. So thank you again, Vanessa, and over to you in the room and in your breakout rooms. Please enjoy your discussion. You can post your questions in the chat room. If you want, we'll pick them up there and call you back after 15 minutes. Okay? Buzz!
I wouldn't mind looking at the four denials.
Sorry?
I wouldn't mind. Do I open all rooms now?
Yes.
I wouldn't mind looking at the
For denials.
four denials.
Have we muted the...
No, but I wouldn't mind looking at the four denials. It's
Okay.
a PowerPoint.
yeah,
Vanessa's going to put it up, I think. I hope.
I can put it here. Wait.
I don't know why we've got this. Should we? Oh, that's why we've got that. Should unpin it? That's what we should have done.
What is that?
I just unpinned you.
So I was pinned. That's the problem. Yeah. Okay. Brilliant.
Why is it?
No, I thought I can get rid of these people out of the way, but I couldn't see what was wrong with them. We still have transcript on.
Ramona, should I go into a room as well? You're muted. Okay, I'll stay here for a minute and then you let me know what you want me to do.
Hello? Hello? Oh,
Hello?
can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, hi. Sorry, I was just driving my son from one point to another. That's why I was muted. So I'm so sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. Yeah. Oh, that was an excellent talk. I really enjoyed it. Wow, what amazing. I'm actually in the same breakout room as you. And I think I really, I mean, two questions that come into mind. It's really interesting. I really liked about your methodology, using the metaphors and
But go, I think we lost you there. You got muted again.
Hello?
You're back.
Hello?
You're
oh,
back.
Good. Yeah, I am. I must.
It's breaking. Ramona, can you put it there back again? I didn't read it.
Hello?
Mm-hmm.
Oh. Hello?
Hello? Yes, you're back.
Good. I don't know what's going on. I am unmuting myself, but it goes on mute again by itself with my mobile phone. So you have to bear with me. I was just saying that how amazing your talk, and I like your initial acknowledgement bit, and I think it's always allows me to reflect silently whom I could acknowledge at that moment if I was asked to. And I think that was amazing. And then I really liked your presentation and your research and how you gather and involved in the research practice, how you gather knowledge and co-productive and co-constitutive way of producing knowledge together with the people that you are learning from. And
We lost you again. I'm so sorry.
Okay. We are just calling back the people in the online place. Sorry. Okay, buzz is coming to an end, and we are calling back the people from the breakout rooms. So can you indicate, please, if you have a question for Vanessa? Just as we'll let the people come back from the breakout rooms, we'll see them flooding back in very shortly. And Vanessa, I hope, is still there. Yeah, here they come back. Bye, Nimi. There's Vanessa. Hello, Vanessa. There we are. We've got you again. Welcome back. That's great. So we're just going to collect questions. Vanessa, are you happy to do a couple of questions at a time? Yeah? Okay. Super. Thank you. Mairead is very kindly going to take the mic round the room to the people with questions in the room. In the chat room, if you have a question that came from your buzz groups, if you'd like to put them in the chat room, and then we'll come back to you to unmute to pose them yourself, yeah? But start in the chat room to put your questions in. Okay, we'll start in the room at Sussex. So we have a couple of questions, people signaling they have a question, let's continue the debate. Yeah.
Firstly, Vanessa, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk, and especially the acknowledgements. I found those really grounding, so thank you. My question is, how has the growth of decolonial conversation in education or in general affected your scholarship and activism?
Thank you. And I saw we have another question, several questions. Here we go.
First of all, thank you, Vanessa, for your presentation, for your lecture. Was so incredible. I was wondering about how to lead or this discourse with indigenous people in Brazil. I was interested in this more applied part in a context when you have people with a quite different conceptual schemes, and they are not thinking about all this. And how is the relationship there? How can you interact with these people that have these different cosmologies and culture? And it's quite interesting because you said that the modernity is dying, but in some cases for them it's just like rising too. So it's a kind of interesting but difficult dialogue for sure. That's my question. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for that. Vanessa, would you like to take two? There are more questions in the room, but would you like to go ahead with those two?
I think so. I'll start with the last one, with Brazil. It's complexities everywhere. Let's put it like this: complexities in the indigenous communities that are heterogeneous, contradictory, as complex as we are. But one of the things that comes from their struggle, especially the struggle of the unequipped people in the Amazon, who we work very closely with, is that what they believe is that the reason why there is this attack right now is because modernity is dying. So what the phrase that they use there that we translated differently here is that the house that the white men built is falling apart, and it's falling on their heads. So they feel that the intensification of violence that we see with Bolsonaro, with Trump, is because modernity has crossed its tipping point. And it's now people are trying to hold on for dear life for the house, and that this is going to fall on their heads first, and that's correct. And then what they say is that we need to learn for them, we need to learn to jump very far, to leap very far. And for that, it is important to create alliances. Now, in terms of the different ontologies and ontometaphysics, one thing that was very important for us, and we learned it both in Canada and in Brazil, was a different approach to working across what Boaventura talks about as the abyssal line, the abyssal thinking. So instead of seeing what they have as knowledge, we approach it as practice. And we try not to ground being on knowing. So our translations are generally translations of practice rather than concepts. So if you go for concepts, yes, there is a myriad of different concepts that can be understood in so many different ways, and that generally we want to fix. But if you go for practice of how we relate to reality, how we relate to pain, how we relate to death, how we relate to renewal, to birth. This was the starting point, I think, of the research, not trying, also because historically, when anthropologists have come to these communities, they have tried to extract the knowledge, the concepts, in order to be able to put them in a book. But what if the ontology itself is not based on this concept? In doing that, there's a violence that is enacted. But if you approach it as practice, you have to engage in the practice and be an apprentice, I think, and then try to document that learning. And I think that's the approach we have taken. So when we take people to the communities, both from our collectives and our other Indigenous people from Canada, we have an interchange program as well. We try to train people to do there are 4 tenets of this kind of education. One is you do not believe in anything, you believe with the community. You do, I'm just trying, do not, what was it? Practice reverence without romanticization and idealization. Then we have do what is needed rather than what you want to do when you're there. So you're going to be put to work, just do it. And there's a 4th one that I can't remember right now, but it's all described in a book that was written by Kasia Hennekew, who's an Indigenous person from here. And the book is called, what is it? Scarring Our Collective Soul Wound, and it's available for free. So if you're interested in that kind of the relationships and the engagements between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, in Indigenous and Indigenous communities, it's all in that book. So thank you for that question. In relationship to the decolonization question, yes, there is a lot of demand right now for us to talk about that, and in a context that is very problematic, in a context of cancel culture too, that is very volatile. And what we see right now is that the decolonization now is a word that is used for everything. So I had somebody another day saying, because just changing the arrangement of the chairs into circle, it's already decolonization. And it's become trivialized and banalized. So the deeper sense of decolonization, and the more political sense as well, which for Indigenous people in Canada is like give the land back. Just get out, basically, in a way, not get out, but at least give the lands that were taken without treaties or agreements, that were confiscated and they are now occupied back. This is the understanding that Indigenous people in Canada insist on. This is more difficult for people to sit with. And yeah, and the psychoanalytical work too is something that not everybody is looking for. So apparently, like we actually have mapped 10 potholes of decolonization. I'll put the link to the chat in the chat, where we see how people are taking the word and making it convenient for whatever it is that they're already doing, right? Which is interesting in terms of popularization, but also it becomes very consumptive. The ambiguity of the word then is exploited for a multiplicity of agendas. So yeah, it has affected our work, yes. We've had to do much more mapping of what it is that we are doing, or that Indigenous people are doing, and what it is that other people are trying to use decolonization for. We have tried to also trace it historically, to think about the former decolonization processes that have happened in terms of territories for nations. We're looking at Mignolo versus Agamben, for example. Their understandings and the understandings have only proliferated and not necessarily in helpful ways, but that's the context of heteroglossia that we inhabit. So we cannot ignore it, we have to engage with it. Does it make the work more difficult? Yeah, sometimes it's great that because it's opening up conversations in contexts where it would be difficult to have these conversations before. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, super. Thank you, Vanessa. There are more questions in the room, but I'd like to take a couple from the chat room first. Angie, you have a question about the processes in the collective. Do you want to unmute and just put that to Vanessa?
Hi, Vanessa. Thank you so
Hello.
much. That was amazing and very, intense listening to you. I'm really interested to find out a bit more about processes. I was reminded a little bit about process work. I'm sure you know about that. And like whether you could say a bit more about what processes you use in the collective, like how you facilitate sitting with the shit, for example.
So I have not yet mapped the resonances with process work. I know it exists, but I don't know much about it in terms of what the literature that is out there. But that's something in my list, the to-do list, that gets interrupted with the decolonization requests. But it's something I'm interested in. I've been trying to map the kind of psychoanalytic approach we're using with other fields of resonance. But the sitting with the shit requires the activation of exiled capacities, because from where we are, how we've been conditioned to avoid it, right? So in order to activate these different capacities that we have in terms of senses and sensibilities, then in order to do that, you need to interrupt the overblown thing that we have also been conditioned to do, which is to search meaning and validation. So the first invitation is to interrupt that. So for example, in a course, we had a pilot course this summer that was very risky. I think, and the university was telling us, like, it was about, so in the realm of climate grief, and we called it facing human wrongs and sitting with historical implication in historical violence and implication in unsustainability. And the university told us that the students, through a pandemic, would be not in the best place to be able to do it. And they were framing mental health issues as a response to the pandemic, in the sense that they're fragile, they can't deal with this. And what we were saying was that maybe they're more fragile if they can, this is what they need to do and they can't do it, right? So maybe not talking about it is causing it. So we convinced them that we would be able to do it, but we had to put in the front load of the course a number of caveats and warnings. So the first thing we said to the students is that we will not coddle you, validate you, or affirm you. Do you still want to do the course? And we lovingly don't care what you think, because we care deeply about how you are going to be able to dig deeper and relate wider. And in order to do that, in order for it to be uncoercive, we cannot care where you're going to arrive at, or where you're at, because it's about changing and questioning and hyper self-reflexivity here. So we don't care about the content, but we care about the process of your thinking and in your disposition and both the willingness and capacity to do more. And we're not going to judge you. Because we know this work is difficult. So it needs to have a lot of compassion, and we need to bring humor in. We need to bring the arts in. So we created walks, guided walks for them to do. We had a lot of guided Netflix exercises for them to watch series, or they were all invitations. They had a series of invitations that they could do. They needed to do 50% of it and then come to a context where we would be talking about it using the bus methodology. There's a bus methodology involved in this, where so it's a methodology for interrupting the coherence of the Cartesian subject, basically, so that you can sit with your own complexities in order to be able to sit with the complexities outside of you. So the idea is that you have a bus inside of you. There are different decks of the bus, but like just for the first deck, there are people, there's one person driving, there are people, passengers at the front, in the middle, at the back. At the back passengers you don't even know very much because they're trying to hide. So you create a suspicion of narration. Basically, we take ourselves as unreliable narrators of our own experience because we're complex inside, and we invite people to look at what's happening with the passengers and to let some passengers speak. So we have a methodology for talking about it, where you can sit with the complexity of the psyche and start giving names to things. In an advanced work, you also go to the different decks of the bus, where in your bus, it's not just your life and the kids and the traumas and the dramas and your parents, it's also the whole humanity. And in another deck, it's the non-humans as well, are all there with you. But you're not using language to story things as a crafting of an identity. You are actually trying to unpack, and we call it diachronic reasoning, unpack where things come from, where things go to, are moving towards, and how they could be thought of differently. So the invitation is for you to become, to be able to, if you can't hold space for your own self, for the complexity of the self, like the likelihood is that you will project what you're trying to repress onto the world, either by vilifying or idealizing something. And that's the idea that we're trying to interrupt in order to be able to sit with the shit. But there's no, so one of the things we insist on is to interrupt the, there's a, what's the word? There's a way of accusatory tone that we're used to using. And that is the one that needs to be interrupted. It's not about blame, accusation, guilt, or shame. It is about understanding how these things are harnessed in terms of social conditioning, right? So that we buy into certain economies. But the working with the shit cannot fall into the same trap. It has to be from a space of humility, of compassion, of humor, and of honesty. So art has been very useful. We have it started as a manifesto of radical tenderness that was done by artist Dani D'Emilia. We have been working with it to make it into a series of body exercises. There's also a deck of cards called Radical Tenderness. But it has to become a practice, an invitation to sit with yourself, very different, and to find a different form of well-being that is not grounded on what we are conditioned to consume. And we've mapped that in neurochemical terms, metaphorically and speculatively. I'm not a neuroscientist, but metaphorically, and it's in the book, like it's dopamine, likes on Facebook, oxytocin, which is this transactional, is self-infantilizing relationship building, adrenaline for numbing, and endorphins for numbing. And we look at endorphins too in terms of its relationship to opioids. It is one opioid produced by the body for pain relief, but how even communities of struggle, like critical communities, are, when you call something out, for example, you visualize a violence, you get this neurophysical sensation that finally it's out there, right? But then there's also a projection saying things are going to change. And when things don't change, then you are looking for the same in something else, and you have to call out something else. And then this breaks communities, this leads people to burnout. So how do we interrupt that association and create more realistic understanding that critique is great for certain things, but it can't do everything, right? And especially if it's creating unrealistic projections and expectations, how it affects your health and well-being in negative ways too. I think I rambled, and I'm also interested in talking about this with people who are interested. So if you want to continue that conversation, I'd be very interested to do so. Sorry for rambling a bit.
Thank you. That was a very full answer. We have a couple of questions. Joe, would you like to put your question before you go? No, it was answered. It was answered. Yeah. Oh, marvelous. Okay, yeah, thank you for that, Joe. But we have another question here. Thank you, Mairead, for. Can you introduce yourself? And yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Vanessa. My name is Odi. I'm a PhD student researching on looking at monuments and symbols. Mm-hmm. And I'll be using more to do indigenous knowledge system, most especially African indigenous knowledge system. Uh-huh. I was a bit kind of taken aback, when you said hospicing modernity. Hospicing modernity, then I asked, you're coming from Brazil, Canada, because I wanted to know why, because what the Aboriginals already said, the house that was built, the house built by the white man is collapsing, and I just wanted to know this hospicing modernity because from the indigenous sense, I'm coming back to the indigenous sense, there is no modernity. And modernity has been modernity has been like the devil made to look like God. Like that is from my own, mm-hmm. And then I'm just asking myself, so why should I be hospicing modernity where the earth, like now, we're talking about global climate change and everybody's returning back to nature. I'm talking about well-being and all those things. And I'm just asking you this question because one thing you said, it's not about the ontology of trying to, means to an end, but actually it's about the practice, it's about the process, it's about being part of the practice. This everyday thing is how you learn. This is what it is. So there's not an end. So I just wanted to know, why should I be hospicing? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. That's a very, very important question. I think I got asked that also in my breakout room. So hospicing means when something is dying, you offer palliative care. You offer, you allow something to die with integrity. So the communities I work with, both in Canada and in Brazil, they reject most aspects of modernity, but not all. And modernity is there as well. Even by calling something science is already a sign that you are in relationship with modernity. And talking about the translations, I don't believe there is any pure place that can be romanticized or idealized as completely outside of modernity. It's a phenomenon. In the book, I talk about who modernity, who the heck is modernity? It is a living entity as a story, as a powerful story of a single story of progress, development, human evolution, and civilization that is extremely violent, that has brought us some gifts as well, but that is now expiring. and is holding on for dear life to stay, but is finding it probably difficult. So learning to hospice it is learning to not invest in its continuity, basically, but not trying to murder it. Sitting with the whole thing that happens when something is dying, which is both the in palliative care, there's a lot of cleaning that happens, and clearing and decluttering, but also sitting with its stories. So unless right now we can't, unless we can learn from human wrongs and the mistakes that have already been made, in whatever option we have of the future that we're working towards, we're bound to repeat the same mistakes that have been made before. And we have been very bad at learning from mistakes and from failures, because modernity itself doesn't like that, and it really focuses on the success. So having a disposition where we can sit with something dying outside and inside of ourselves, all the comforts that it offers, all the securities, the promise of futurity, the promise of progress, the promise of betterment, of self-actualization, of improvement. These are all coming from the same conditioning, right? Then the question is, what is human nature? What is conditioned? And that's a conversation that is interesting as well to have. But if we see the history of modernity, and especially in its cognitive affective imprints, we're all, like, by talking about this right now and talking to the indigenous communities about things, we're already in relation to it or are implicated in it. It's very difficult to be outside of it, especially if we're in academia, right? And in an institution that was created to uphold modernity's promises and tenets. So I agree with you that there's part of me, a passenger on my bus, that says, why should I hospice it? Or some people we would say, like, let it die, and it has done enough harm. But there's a lot of other passengers that say, right, it's an elder. We need to and it has been a harmful one, and we still need to look after it, and offer what it needs right now to die, so that we can also benefit from the stories of the mistakes it has made, so that in the future we will only make different mistakes, not the same ones that have been made before. And if you want to continue this conversation too, I'm very interested, so please get in touch.
Great, okay. Thank you for that, Vanessa. Adi is putting his hand to his heart, and I think you really got him there with that. Modernity has been saved, temporarily at least. Yeah, great. So we have another question in the chat room from Ramona, who's interested in the VUCA phrase. Ramona, do you want to just say what your question? Is Ramona there? Perhaps she has to go, but in the...
Oh, I think she can't unmute. We were having that problem before, but I can read it. I would be interested in how you think the VUCA world started, basically.
There's Ramona, sorry, yeah. Ramona, put your question. No, fine. Okay, so you got to the question there. Yeah, let's carry on. Yeah.
So about VUCA. Yes. So volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. I think it's always been there. It's just that now, and we've been protected from it. But like for the indigenous people, and like especially the Hunikui, who are the Amazonian guardians of the forest that we work with, it's the community, 16,000 people, but they already have the sense of heteroglossia of many languages, because they live in a place where there are lots of other indigenous peoples who believe in different things. We have different ontologies, right? So for them, the complexity has been there from day one when everything started, right? And they don't see humans as the only producers of speech or knowledge. So for them, the layers of complexity have always been there. The uncertainty has always been there. Volatility in terms of how colonizers came, or other indigenous groups, conflicts with other indigenous groups. But modernity itself has kind of sanitized these things and tried to impose language that had one fixed meaning that is put in a dictionary, knowledge that goes in an encyclopedia. All of these things gave us a false sense of stability and security, but outside of the house, everything was dynamic and what we would say from the house, chaotic. But there is entropic chaos and there's deterministic chaos. One of them is destructive, but the other one is super creative. I think the communities outside of the house or or near the house are experience both, and they experience both chaos that is destructive when the house dumps its waste onto their lands or their heads, but they also experience that the VUCA, they experience complexity, ambiguity, and uncertainty in a very different way. Volatility is a different case, but the other ones, it's a source of creativity. It's a source of resilience. It's a source of stamina. And that practice of not having been protected from VUCA gives them also a lot of strength that we actually don't have. Right. So in Brazil, we have this saying that in a situation of a flood, it's only when the water reaches our waistline or our bum that we can actually swim. Before that, if the flood, the waters are rising, if they are at our ankles, we can only walk. If they are even at our knees, we can only walk. But when they are at our waistline, it's possible for us to have a very different relationship with the water. And I think these communities remind us that in VUCA times, if the water is the VUCA, it's possible for us to swim. That's what they can't teach you how to swim. They can't, because their river is different from ours. And they can't give you a replacement for the security that you're seeking, but they can remind you that we can swim, that our bodies are mostly water, that we are the water, and that we can have a very different relationship with the water. So yeah, I think VUCA for us who have been protected from it in the global north, it's coming to our door like this and in a very negative way through populism and general instability and general capacity to hold our shit together. But it's been there before, and it was a sanitization process that created our fragility and our incapacity to deal with it. And now we're going to have to learn to swim.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I think we are almost up to time, but how wonderful was that? How inspiring, how inventive, how creative, and filled us with lots of lovely metaphors and new ways of thinking about these things. So I'm really delighted that you were able to join us tonight and share with us something about your collective, and wish you every success. Well, success is probably not the right word. Complexity, ambiguity, all the
generative.
And yeah, good luck to you and your team.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for the questions and for the engagement. And if you like, the book is already out. It was out last week, but on the website, we have loads of materials that are Creative Commons and available for everybody. Like 70% of the book is actually available for free on the website. So the book is not very expensive, but there's also a lot of there's a commitment to Creative Commons, and through this commitment we also raise funds for the communities. And right now there are 2 fundraisers there, both for communities in Brazil and in Canada, that organizations that are Indigenous led and that are trying to bring both the land and Indigenous lives to health and well-being. So thank you again.
Marvelous. Thank you. Join me please in a round of applause for a wonderful presentation from Vanessa. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm just going to hand over to Mairead, who is going to introduce the topic of next week's seminar.
Yes,
in
just
the CI
just
Centre
just
here.
as we think we are doing the deconstruction or the palliative care of modernity. Next week we've got another speaker coming, one in the series. It's Dr. Sam Ochere from the University of Bristol, talking about decolonizing childhoods, rethinking emancipation, a critical assessment of anti-trafficking rhetoric and interventions. His work is trying to undo the dominant discourses that come from development, the discourses of and practices of anti-trafficking around Lake Volta in Ghana. And he's trying to rescue children who are purportedly trafficked and enslaved in these fishing communities. But his argument is about the colonial pejorative construction of Black and brown children and the communities as pathetic objects in need of rescue from primitive traditions and practices. There you are, a man after our own hearts. So we wait to hear from Dr. Ochere next week, same time. Thank you all very much for coming. Thanks again to Vanessa. Thank you to everybody online. The IDS bar waits for those people who want to talk more.
Yeah,
Sorry
Vanessa,
that you can't
I'm sorry
make
you
it.
can't join us.
Okay, thanks very much.
We're going to... Okay. Thank you, Vanessa, again. Okay, we'll be in touch separately. Wonderful seminar. Thank you. Yeah. Good luck with your project.